I will share my screen. All right, so welcome everybody to Scrum Masters of the Universe. As Marsha said, welcome, and you're encouraged to turn your cameras on. This is being recorded, so if you don't want your face shown, feel free to turn them off, but we'd love to see your smiling faces. Our mission here at Scrum Masters of the Universe is to provide a place for Scrum practitioners to learn, grow, flourish in applying Scrum in the world of work. And we acknowledge there's great value in getting out of our silos and connecting with others who are passionate about growth as a Scrum Master. Here's our leadership team. Make no mistake, Jamie Kriegel is Batman. I am Robin. I'm your host today. I will try to do my best to live up to Jamie's everything you know and have heard about Jamie, but there's our LinkedIn information if you want to, if you care to connect with us. And speaking of connecting, might be a good time for you to take a screenshot. If you want to connect with us, we'd love to hear from you. There's 3 ways there to connect. You're probably already in on Meetup if you're in on this session. I want to thank our sponsor, Scrum Alliance. And without further ado, I want to welcome our guest, Ms. Marsha Acker. So we're honored to be hosting Marsha, author of The Art and Science of Facilitation, How to Lead Effective Collaboration with Agile Teams, for a conversation around Agile Team Facilitation. Marsha is a professional facilitator and executive and team coach with 25 years of experience supporting leaders as they tackle complex challenges and spearhead change in the organization. The founder and CEO of TeamCatapult, she uses systems thinking, structural dynamics, dialogue, and agility to help teams collaborate and align with clarity, purpose, and vision. Please welcome Miss Marsha Acker.
That's awesome. Mark, that is hands down the most engaging intro I think I've had online. So I'm not sure I can live up to the intro. That was fantastic. So thanks. Welcome everybody. So I want to start out. My intention today is to talk about facilitation and the art and science of it, and sort of why do we come together to facilitate, and oftentimes we're after collaboration. And so my intent is that we're going to be a little collaborative today and interactive, and you're at choice. So if at any point, we might use breakout rooms in a little while, and so if you don't want to participate, you can just put yourself on mute and stay off video, and that's okay. However, here's what I would love to do is just check in on this word about collaboration. I think we use words to mean lots of different things for all of us, but if you can sort of get tapped into what does collaboration mean to you, and you can just put it in the chat, so share it with others to hear a little bit about, like, when I say collaboration, what comes to mind? What does it mean to you? Great. Working together, 2 + 2 = 5. Dialogue, connecting brains, work on the same goal. Yeah, transparency, great, keep them coming. Enabling team dynamics and co-creation and being open and encouraging communication, leveraging diverse perspectives. Yes, all the above. And if I think about how I want collaboration to go, even if I'm a participant in the collaboration, like I think about how you want to feel. I want to feel engaged. I want to be asked for my point of view. I want to feel heard, even if I don't have necessarily control or final decision-making authority. Like I want to be involved in it in some way. So I'm also going to encourage you to have a sheet of paper maybe next to you as we go through the day. We're here for an hour and a half. I am going to share my screen, and I've got slides. I'm actually not going to put it on the slideshow just because Zoom handles slides in a way that just takes up my whole screen, and then I can't see you. And I really, I know there are just a few of you on screen, but it's fun to be able to speak to people rather than into a blank wall. So that's a little bit of why I'm going to do what I do. So this is, we'll talk a little bit today about the art and science of facilitation, and I'll talk a bit about some of the things that are in my book, titled The Art and Science of Facilitation. If any of these things are important to you, those are the sort of alphabet soup of certifications. What I'd say is a bit about how I came to this. So I have 2 degrees in software engineering, and nowhere in that process did someone teach me or model for me what it meant to work with other human beings. And so I came to the skills of facilitation and coaching actually after I got into my job. And so the first part of my career was spent in sort of a business analyst project management role where I was bridging the gap between the end users and developers, and I was using facilitation as a process to do that. And my first introduction to facilitation was actually in 1994, and it fundamentally changed how I thought about interacting with people and engaging with people, this notion of creating a space where it was invitational and welcomed people into a space of collaborating. All the words that you just put in the chat, co-creating, two heads are better than one, all of those kind of key phrases. And I have had kind of quite that journey over time. There is a bias that I have around facilitation that I think it is a fundamental leadership skill. And I also think that is one of the key things that we sort of take for granted. It's a bit like it's just assumed that it's already there or that everybody knows how to do it. And I think if you've experienced really good facilitation, you might not know it. And if you've experienced no facilitation or maybe unskillful facilitation, you'll definitely know it. So I think it's one of those things that you miss it if it's absent, and you probably might not think twice about it if it's there, which in turn makes it a skill and a competency that potentially is undervalued and overlooked. So that's a little bit about me and where we're going to go today. So a couple of things that I hope to share with you. One are some common assumptions that you might be making about your facilitation or just about facilitation in general. So there are many, but we're just going to look at a couple of those today. And then we're going to explore, so I talk in the book about the notion of a facilitation stance. Where's the place that you come from? What are your beliefs about teams and how they work in groups? And then how does that inform how you show up in the room when you're working with teams? And so we'll do an exploration around that. And then at the last part, I'm going to just give you some practical steps, ways that you can take action to make some potential differences in your facilitation. So that's where we're headed today. And let's start by this whole concept of just some common assumptions that we often make, including myself. And it's really, it ties back to that notion of how much of a contrast there can be when facilitation is present versus when it's not. And so here are some assumptions that I find are very common. One is assuming that facilitation is a skill that everybody already has because they do it every day, right? We sit in meetings all day, every day. There are all kinds of statistics. Harvard Business Review writes about it often, about the number of hours and what it costs for the meetings that we have in the Agile space. There are lots of practices. There are opportunities to bring teams together. And so we do sit in meetings. And I think there's a natural assumption that to be in meetings or to be leading the meeting also then makes you the facilitator, and that we already know how to do that. So that could be one. Another one is assuming that the facilitator is the person making the decisions, or that the person making the decisions is the facilitator. So sometimes I think these two responsibilities get kind of lumped together. It's not wrong, but again, I think there's real intentionality and power in pulling them apart and looking at them they can still be done by the same person, but they're different come from places, and ways to think about how you can be clear about that for you and your team. And another one is hosting an online meeting, because this is how we all meet most of the past 13 months. And it's hosting an online meeting much like you would a phone call, with little or no preparation involved in that process. So it's just a jump on, hop in, and get started type of space. And another assumption tied closely to that is jumping right into the work of the meeting without setting the stage for success. So we'll talk about some ways that you can prepare people. It's a bit like priming the pump or warming them up and preparing them to come in and invite them into a space that's really about them being their most creative, collaborative selves. So if any of those assumptions kind of ring true for you, on that sheet of paper that you have, you might just jot down, how, if you reflect and think about your meetings right now, how effective are they? Do you reach your desired outcome? How often do you surface difficult topics? And how much of the real conversation comes into the room, and how much of the conversation goes offline? And by that I mean offline to a Slack group or a chat, or you have the meeting and then you call your colleague or friend afterwards and you go, oh my goodness, I cannot believe that that's what we did. So the real conversation starts to come offline rather than being online and in the room. And then the other place that I'd point you to look is, are your decisions sticky? Like, do they stick? Or do you find yourself having the same conversation every time you come together? And you're struck by didn't we talk about this a couple weeks ago? I thought we closed that out. And now here we are having the same conversation again. So how you answer these questions is a really good sort of litmus test about where are we with our collaborative process, and how might you or somebody else design it to be a little bit different. I'm big on defining things. So we talked just a moment ago about collaboration. I think another very commonly overused word is, what is facilitation, or what is a facilitator? So this is how I define it, and it's defined in the book. We also have facilitation classes that we run. But I've defined it as the art and science of leading people through processes toward agreed upon outcomes in a manner that encourages participation, ownership, and creativity from all involved. And I do believe that there is some science to why we do what we do, science around how communication happens, interpersonal dynamics, behavior, bias that we bring into the room. I think there's science around that. And I think there's a bit of art to how you show up and make choices in the moment, because I don't really think that there's all that much in facilitation that you can get wrong. I do think that there are choices that you make that have impacts that are either helpful or not helpful, or propel a group forward or keep a group stuck. And so I think facilitation is a lot about that art piece comes a bit from, how do I dance in the moment and figure out what's needed in the group and what's required of me. And then there's the phrase in this definition that often gets people hung up a bit is towards agreed upon outcomes, because people say, well, wait a minute, aren't we supposed to figure out, what we're doing? Like, the outcome will be what comes out of the meeting. And what we'll talk about today is how I think the outcomes actually get defined in terms of the purpose and what we want to achieve before you ever walk into the room. And then what emerges from the group is the content, and you let the group own the content. But the outcome is somewhat defined, because that was sort of, as a facilitator, that's kind of my guiding North Star. Why are we here and what are we here to do? And those become, with my guiding North Star defined, then it allows me to sort of dance around in the moment about what's happening in the group. And I think it's important to define facilitation and sort of the role of facilitator as process owner and the group as owning the content, because facilitator is another one of those words that gets used a lot to mean everything from the person who sent me the calendar invite, and if we were back in the room, or maybe some of you were in the room, but if we were in the room, ordered the pizza or the snacks that got everybody to come to the meeting. And then I think facilitators can get a little hung up on needing to sort of be the secretary, for lack of a better word, of the group, or the cheerleader of the group, or there's some kind of role around that, when there's actually so much more that facilitators can be doing to guide that process and really paying attention to multiple levels of what's happening in the room. So what are the group dynamics like? Where are we at with our outcomes? Who's speaking? Who's taking more airtime and less airtime? And who are we not hearing from? And how can I create a process that's including others? So that's a little bit around the definition of facilitation. And some assumptions, common assumptions that I see. So next I want to talk a little bit about what do you believe about teams and the art of facilitation. So this first mistake, and there's a couple of assumptions in that, are assuming that facilitation is a skill that everybody already has, or that facilitation and decision making are sort of lumped together. And in the book, I talk about the Agile Team Facilitation stance, and it is a set of 5 kind of guiding principles, which are those shapes that you see around the outside, kind of the gray shapes of it. There are 5 of them, and then inside are the 4 kind of key competencies that make up facilitation. So the inner green part of self-awareness and self-management, group awareness and group process, or the competencies that we bring. We're not really going to talk about those today, but what I do want to do is give us a chance to kind of explore that outer boundary of the 5 guiding principles. You can download a copy of this. It's actually not behind any kind of firewall or anything at Art and Science of Facilitation. You can just grab that picture. It's sort of about halfway down the page. And if you don't want to do that, what I'd encourage you to do is just jot down on your sheet of paper these 5 principles, because in a moment, I'm going to ask you to just join a breakout group and you'll have a brief conversation. Because what I want you to do is just together with a couple of other people, make up a definition about what you think the guiding principle, one of these guiding principles means. So you won't have time to work on all 5 of them. So just jot them down, and you as a group will select one. But there are 5, and so if we start at the top right corner, the first one is honoring the wisdom of the group, and then next is maintaining neutrality, and then at the very bottom is upholding the Agile mindset and principles. Over to the left is standing in the storm, and then in the top left corner is holding the group's agenda. So those 5 guiding principles, and here's what I'd say a bit before I'm going to open up breakout rooms, is the guiding principles are intended to provide a definition around, like, what do we believe, or what would be helpful, I guess, to believe about groups and teams when you walk in and you're going to facilitate a group of people. And so underneath each of these guiding principles are likely some assumptions that we might be making as facilitators. And then that tends to inform how we act in the room when we are facilitating. So I'd love for you to have, I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to do that so I can actually open up breakout rooms. But I'm going to ask you to make up a definition about what you think those guiding principles might be, and ask you to just pick one that you want to explore together. And if you give me just a moment.
And I'm not on video.
All right. So I'm going to open up breakout rooms. You'll have about 3 or 4 people to that will be in your breakout room. If you don't want to participate, you don't have to. But I'm going to ask you to have a conversation. I'm going to open them up. Sorry, I'm talking and navigating at the same time. Oh, okay. You're going to have the conversation for about 8 minutes, and then we'll close the breakout rooms. And I'm going to ask you to have maybe one person that's willing to be a spokesperson when you come back in the large group. And we're not going to hear from everybody, but I will ask if we can just hear from maybe one or two people around each cornerstone about what's the conversation that you had. All right, so I'm going to open up breakout rooms. You should get a notice, and it'll invite you to join, and we'll see you back in about 8 minutes. Oops. Okay. All right, here we go.
Hey, Marsha, good job.
Thanks. Mark, you might want to pause the recording. All right.
That went really fast.
That went really fast.
I've run sessions and said, okay, you have 8 minutes or 10 minutes, and I didn't realize how fast it went.
It's really, I do find it interesting to be like the facilitator versus the participant, and I've had that same experience. So I always talk about you get zoomed right out of your conversation, and then when it's happening to me, it's really frustrating. As a facilitator, it's great because it keeps us moving along. But great. So hopefully you got a chance to talk with a couple of people. So welcome back. And I love it when we have children and pets and other coworkers in the video. So welcome to everybody. And let's have a little bit of a conversation. So I'm curious about if we start at the top right corner. I'll turn my screen share back on so that we can be looking at the model. But the top right corner of honoring the wisdom of the group. So I'm curious if there was anybody that talked about honoring the wisdom of the group. And if you want to share a bit about what you talked about, what definition did you make up?
I'm happy to go.
Thank you.
My name is Daniel,
Hi, Daniel.
as you can see from the bottom of my screen there. So we talked about, basically the definition we came up was relying on the team to provide their own expertise and not being involved in the decision-making ourselves.
Yep. Yeah, what you're pointing to is this combination of you as a facilitator staying out of the content and letting the group own that and being the process owner. And then there's also some beliefs underneath of that. So I think to take that action says that I trust and believe that there is collective wisdom in that group. And in my experience, a bit more of what sits underneath of that is that groups really do have a collective intelligence about them. But I think what we do when we come together is we do a lot of putting blockers in place that get in the way of that collective intelligence. So things like turn taking and something might have happened and we are frustrated by it, so we start to fall back into the group and not come forward and lean in and play. So I think there are lots of things that we do when we come together that tends to block or impede that collective intelligence. And this cornerstone does point to the fact that, and yet it exists. So if we believe that there is wisdom in the group, and that one of our roles as a facilitator is to honor that that's there, and to believe that a group is capable of getting to decisions and answers on their own, and that it's about mining and pulling some of that wisdom and intelligence out, that collective intelligence, then that's a little bit of what that particular guiding principle is about, or what it's speaking to in that space. Thanks, Daniel. So let's move around to maintaining neutrality. Who talked about that and would be willing to share a bit about your definition?
Yes, I can go. Actually, let me put in video.
Great. Hello.
Yeah, hi. We actually, one of the things is that we felt that maintaining neutrality and standing in the storm kind of goes hand in hand, which is creating a safe space for people to share their ideas in non-judgmental fashion, where the facilitator is more passive rather than an active judge of the ideas. And kind of maintaining neutrality goes with standing in the storm, where kind of the floodgates are open, everybody's kind of talking. And it's really kind of the job of facilitators to make sure that nobody turns the spouts off and says, hey, that's it. It's my way or highway.
Yeah. And I'm curious, did you all talk about any tensions, certainly as in the Agile world, any tensions that you might feel in that maintaining neutrality space?
Yeah, we didn't talk about that in our exchange.
That's okay.
We did talk about that in our group. We were talking about how sometimes you don't have the liberty to be as to say the things you would like to say, maybe because you are internal and the hierarchy dictates that you are careful about the things that you're saying. Even though you may be the facilitator, you may also need to be mindful of your level, and how sometimes when you're consulting, you have a bit more freedom to stand in that position more comfortably.
Yes. Yeah, so Michaela, I think and Jillian both, those are great. So there are a couple of things that I want to highlight what you were both pointing to. One is maintaining neutrality and stand in the storm. They're all intercommingled when you're in the room. So this diagram definitely points to sort of an artificial construct of kind of pulling them apart, because they really do connect with each other. And the maintaining neutrality piece of really, again, letting the group own the content and you own the process, and watching where you might have bias or opinion or judgment, and really being able to suspend that in some way, and to stay actively out of content, but actually really actively in the process part of it. So I think about facilitation as, I do think sometimes it can be seen as just sort of facilitator fade all the way to the back and letting the group come forward. And there are moments, I think, where you do that. But facilitators actually play a pretty active role in the process component of it. So helping a group see what's happening. And Jillian, what you're pointing to, in an Agile team, this maintaining neutrality does come with some tension. So if you're an external coach or you're an external facilitator and you come in to do a meeting, it could be easier. I don't think it's uber easy, but it could be easier to maintain neutrality. You might have less of a stake in the outcome. Whereas on an Agile team, you very much might have, you've got the organizational culture of it surrounds you, you've got the operating norms of the team that you might be aware of, you might be part of the team, you might have a very clear opinion or perspective, or you might even be on the hook for how the team is performing and what happens at the end. And so I think being really aware of some of the tension that can be created in that space of neutrality, and also to understand the benefits to the group and that collective intelligence that exists that can be very helpful if you really do find that space of neutrality. And so we'll talk a bit today about maybe some specifics on how that can help you in that space of maintaining neutrality. But here it's just helpful, I think, to name like what we're going for and the belief that sits here that to come in and sort of insert my opinion can be one of the blockers to that collective intelligence. So just finding your way around some of that tension and being able to work with it. So it's really helpful. Thank you both for that. All right, let's move on to upholding the Agile mindset and principles. Did anybody talk about that? And willing to share? I guess we don't need them. we can just chuck them, right? They're unimportant. Here's what I'd say about upholding the Agile mindset and practices as it relates to the stance of a facilitator. it comes from the place that when you're working with a team, if you are channeling and helping a group learn practices, understand what the values look like, way more than just words on a piece of paper or an espoused value, but actually what it looks like to value it in our day-to-day practice and behavior. I think there's a tension here of holding really tightly to it has to look a certain way. And if you're able to step into the space of looking at teams, they develop over time. I think some of the pitfalls, like we could create lots of lists of pitfalls of what's happening in Agile teams where if I have to attend a stand-up that asks me the same questions again, I think I'm going to lose my mind. Or if I have to go to another retro that I feel like we're just, you know, moving things around and having the same conversation, but nothing really changes. I think when we experience those things, it's a really good chance to check in with ourselves about where might we be holding really tightly or strongly to this Agile value has to look like this in practice, and when might we be able to let go of the what it looks like and hold on to the value or principle first. And so what I mean by like a really practical example of how that might look is those three questions that get asked in daily stand-ups. For a team starting out, it's really helpful. Give me some structure, help me learn the practice and what it's like to around the value of leveling the playing field and checking in with each other. And at some point when we're not getting value from that anymore, to let that go and ask the team what would be helpful now. What would we change about that, or how might we adapt those questions? So it's really about holding what it looks like lightly and then being willing to experiment with the other aspects of it. So if we move around to on the left, bottom left, is standing in the storm. So I know someone talked about that. So who's going to go? Anyone?
I can chat a little bit about that from our group.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So like kind of, I think it was Mikhail's note earlier, it kind of dovetails with maintaining neutrality. And there was kind of like two sides of maybe that storm coin. The first being, you know, when there's conflict or tension in the room, maintaining that grounded presence, that kind of calm, steady, so that conflict and tension can surface and be addressed, and rather than moving past it very quickly, maybe allowing the space for that. And the other side of that coin was, you know, in ideation or, you know, creativity or brainstorming, when the group is going and when the group is riffing, it's kind of also important to have that calm, steady presence, to act as kind of a guidepost, because if everyone gets caught up in that kind of wave, it can be hard to readjust or reorient. So that was some of what we discussed in our group.
That's lovely. As you say it, you have a calming presence as you even talk about it. So there is this aspect of to stand in something means to be there, be steady in it, and to be okay with it. And I think we will all, likely every one of us on this call might have, you know, a slightly different way we would describe our own level of personal comfort when conflict emerges in the room. And conflict can look anything like, I disagree with what you said, all the way up to shouting and calling somebody name or making it personal. So there can certainly be degrees of conflict in what that looks like. And then there will also probably be degrees of how we each individually respond to it. And I talk often, I share several stories in the book about how this was the one that was probably the one that I've done the most work on for myself, in that early on in those early days of facilitation, I did everything I could to not stand in any storms. I managed that conflict right on out of the room every single time. And that looked like if I felt like the heat was rising in the room, that seemed like a really good time for a break. So let's everybody go get some coffee and come back after you've cooled down, to pushing things off to the side or sidestepping. So I did all the above, because standing in conflict, I actually didn't know what to do with it when it came in the room. And I felt really unskillful about how to work with a group of 25 or 30 people if they were in disagreement about something. What I'd say about where I'm at with that today is I see it as one of the most critical roles that we as facilitators can play. And I don't think, in all my experience with teams, I think it's the rare team that will actually make space for themselves to stay in a storm, to stay in disagreement, to welcome it. I think teams naturally do the thing that I was talking about you do as well, which is call for a break or take it offline or do something, but it can feel more difficult. And what I know about how teams work now is that it is only in working through that conflict to actually create space for it, welcome it into the room. As I was talking about all those offline conversations that people have, those are often conflict, or it's seen in a different way. And it's a way of not bringing it into the space. And so I work a lot with teams to help them normalize it and make it okay to actually bring the conversation in the room. And then for myself as a facilitator to stay with it. Like, what would it look like to stay with that conversation rather than push it to a parking lot or call for a break? And so I think there's real value in the ability for a team to work with those things. I also think it's the key thing that changes those repetitive conversations. And I think it's what sits behind the reason that we have the same conversation over and over again. It's often because it goes offline and not online. So there's so much to that standing in the storm. And it's also very much supported by the other things. Mark, I want to check with you because my sense is that my internet connection is fading a bit. Can you hear me? I'm good? Okay.
You're great.
Well, that's fantastic. It's definitely fading on my end, so I'm glad it's not on yours. All right, so the last one up at the very top left is holding the group's agenda. So who talked about that?
I can touch on this one a little bit.
Nice.
So we had two other people. Well, we had three, but one wasn't able to participate. So there were three of us total that talked about it. And kind of what we came up with is the ability to clearly state the purpose of the meeting and time box the topics to meet assigned time frame while using a parking lot to encourage later discussion. So, one of the things that we talked about was that it's so hard when you're on a time limit and the conversation gets going and maybe it's going in the right direction or maybe it's not, but you still have to cut it short, but making sure that they know that conversation is still valuable and important and that we hear them. So maybe having a parking lot. So if there's time at the end of the meeting, we can circle back to it. Otherwise, follow up at a later date.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you. There's, I want to pull out sort of two things that I hear you speaking to. And the hold the group's agenda is, it's a both and kind of thing. So agenda is one of those words that, Jennifer, as you said, it's partly the time boxing and like what's hanging on the wall, the in-person wall or the virtual wall about what we're going to accomplish today. So there's the agenda kind of in the moment. And then there's also the second part I think that you were pointing to is that we call that a little A agenda hanging on the wall. And then there's this bigger A agenda of what's really happening for this team and an overall arc of the team working on something. And so how that can look in the moment is we might be scheduled to talk next about a hypothesis that we have and an experiment that we want to try around something else. And you notice as you move the group to that conversation, there's quite a bit of pushback, or people don't want to go. They want to go back to the other thing, or they want to keep talking about something they were talking about. And it can feel a bit like you are trying to pull a group forward and they don't want to go. And I think that's always a really good, if you have that experience in the moment in a room, it's a really great place to check in on, so am I holding tightly to an agenda? And then whose agenda is it? So my agenda can sometimes be to get through the items on the, my watch wants to talk to me. My agenda could be that I want to get through the items on the wall and then move through it quickly so that I can feel good about having accomplished what I said we were going to do and get to the outcomes. And I can get a little bit attached to that. And rather than it's great to get curious about what's causing the group to sort of push back. And are they holding a bigger agenda? So their bigger agenda might be, we've talked about this over and over again, and I don't want to talk about it anymore. I'm not done talking about the thing that we just left. And I feel like we've left some things on the table. And so there might be a bigger agenda that hasn't really come forward. And I talk a bit about it being an emergent agenda, meaning it's the concept of it or the thought of it is actually emerging through the conversation. And it will show up in ways of people feeling like resistance moving forward, or it can feel like, Jennifer, I think you pointed to this when you said, keeping people on task or putting things in a parking lot. And so that is a choice point of, there might be moments where I say, it feels like something big here is happening and we have a choice. We can either stick to what we were going to talk about today or talk about this. Which do you want to do? And one of them is likely going to have to go into some kind of parking lot. But I really want that to be the group's call and not my call, because this is about their content and about where they're coming from. So that holding a group's agenda is a really great place to sort of check in with yourself on where are we at and what does this look like? And am I driving too much? Is this my agenda? Is this something that I want for them? Or is it something that the group really wants? And I think you'll feel that and sometimes in resistance that you get from a group. So it's really helpful. Okay, so those are the 5 kind of guiding principles, and they are very merged together. I use the metaphor a lot of kind of dancing around in those. I will find at different moments in time working with a group where I'm leaning more heavily on one over the others, but they are often all intermingled and there. And I think it's helpful to think about, of those 5, which is the one that you feel like is really strong for you? Like, you've got this at this moment in time. It just comes naturally. And, which is the one that maybe your group needs from you the most right now? And that can be really helpful if you think about focusing on something that you want to work on. All right, so moving along in our roadmap for today. So we've talked a little bit about some common assumptions and the facilitation stance of like, what do you believe? Like, what are the beliefs that really serve you as you begin to work with teams? And so I'm going to move us into a bit more of the practical steps that you might take. And then I've saved a little bit of time for just some Q&A, and we'll have some conversation. So this next set of assumptions that we're looking at can be that just the fast startup, right? So we treat a meeting like a phone call. Give everybody the Zoom line, give them the Jamboard or the Mural link, and then we're off with very little startup and planning. So something to think about for groups when they come into any kind of facilitated session is they will have some conscious or unconscious questions. So I think some of them, sometimes people are aware that they have these questions and other times they are less aware. But whenever we come into any kind of meeting, there will be kind of 5 primary questions that we are thinking about. And the first one is, why am I here? And then once I'm sort of clear about my purpose and what I'm doing here, then my next question is going to be, and who else is here with me? And how do we relate to one another? And then the third question is going to be, what are we trying to achieve? And then number 4, how should I behave so we can do it, which is where all the working agreements come from. And number 5 is when can I leave? And so for some of us, these will be conscious, others will be unconscious, but until our brains get answers to these 5 questions when we start up a meeting, the brain will be trying to process what's happening with all 5 of these questions. So as you prepare for meetings, I think it's really helpful to think about how can you help a group answer these, sometimes even answer them before they come into the room. And that happens quite often in both your planning and preparation, but then also how you're starting up the meeting. And so what you're conveying to a group of people as you get started. So today we're going to spend just a little bit of time thinking about 2 very, what I think are very important aspects of facilitation that get minimized or overlooked entirely when we're in that space of just getting in and getting it done. So we have a facilitation process, and it's made up of 5 different steps. So the first one is planning. The second one is design. Those happen before we ever get into the room. And then the conduct phase is the guide to getting started. So helping people answer those 5 questions. And then the whole process of a meeting follows this the flow of explore. So big, wide exploration. This is where brainstorming happens. This is the easy part, by the way, what is also maybe considered the fun part of facilitation. It's when we brainstorm and all the sticky notes go up on the wall, be it in room or virtual. So we're exploring all the possibilities, and then we start to evaluate and narrow down the alternatives, and then getting to a decide, and then a close. And I think that evaluate and decide are 2 of the harder parts of facilitation. This is easy, big, wide, expansive, and then how in the world do we narrow all of that down and get to a decision? And so your facilitated session might actually go through multiple phases of that. You might do an explore, evaluate, and decide multiple times. And then a really clear close, like what did we accomplish today? Who needs to know about it? How are we going to communicate? And then I talk a lot about how to not, capture what came out, but also how to get feedback about your facilitation, not about whether somebody liked it so much as to get feedback about what they appreciated and what they accomplished, and then let that feed into how you grow as a facilitator. But today, so that's kind of the broad brush of the facilitation process. And today, what we're going to do is focus a lot more on just those first 2 phases of planning and design. So some key principles for planning, or some keys to planning. I would love to just hear in the chat box, if I can make my way over to it. I'm going to stop my slideshare for just a moment. Okay, so now I can see the chat. So I'm curious, just by either a show of hands visually, or you can put into the chat, how many of you conduct what I would call a sponsor interview prior to a meeting? And by sponsor, I mean the person who stands to gain the most from the outcome of the meeting. Great, Maru, not you. Anybody else do that? And just, yeah, great. Okay, nice. Okay. So maybe, so here's what I find. So that's actually what I was really looking for, Maru, is just no time. So I think one of the challenges that is, for certain, it's a real challenge in our day-to-day work, is we go from meeting to meeting to meeting, and this concept of finding time to plan and design can feel elusive. So I don't think that every meeting that you have necessarily requires a full planning and design, but here's something to know. Planning and design takes about 2.5 times your meeting time in order to be effective. So if you're going into a 4-hour meeting, you're looking at anywhere from about 8 or 9 to 10 hours of planning and design time. Now that's got to be bounced up against how collaborative is your meeting that you want to hold. And then over time, I think that that metric can go down as you create facilitator guides and you're able to reuse some of that. But if you think a little bit about the concept of putting about 2.5 times your meeting time into that planning and design phase, I think that's where some of the power in facilitation comes if we're going for full collaboration. Now, there might be other meetings where you're just looking for a few key inputs, or where you just want to tell people about what's happening, and that can be really different. So I'm going to turn my slides back on. And so in this notion of planning, one of the most important aspects of planning is to conduct a sponsor interview. And that is, if you want to think about it just more as a conversation that you have with somebody about what would be the intended ideal outcome of this meeting. And then there's a series of questions that you can ask, and they are really intended to prompt thinking about, why are we coming together? What do I want to get out of this? And then who should come? What will their roles be? And I think one of the most important questions to ask ahead of a meeting is, what decisions will be made? And what is the scope of authority for the group in making those decisions? I think one of the fastest ways to lose street cred as a facilitator is to ask people to invest themselves, because I think collaboration is an investment, but to invest themselves and care enough about a topic to create a storm, to stay with the storm, to offer up their viewpoints and opinions, and then believe that they are the ones making the final decision, only to have somebody else 2 weeks later come around and undo the decision that they think they made. And then you get to convey that to the team. And then pretty soon, a couple weeks later, nobody wants to come to facilitated collaborative meetings anymore. And you might start to hear things like, why bother? I just want to get my work done. I don't want to collaborate. Why would I continue to invest myself in this work if everything that I do is just going to get undone? So I think really one of the most key critical conversations to have upfront with a sponsor is, what are we doing? Are we as a team going to make a decision? Are we making a recommendation? Or are we brainstorming some ideas that then are going to get passed off to somebody else, and then that's who's going to make the decision? So all of that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with a team making a recommendation. But what's really helpful is when you're clear about that up front prior to the meeting starting. So now I, as a participant, know, how much am I going to get invested in this? How much am I going to invest in putting myself out there, feeling like I'm taking a risk by offering what I really think? I want to know, like, to what degree am I going to have influence in this conversation, and what's my role in it? So I think being really clear, and I find that when I have these kinds of questions with a sponsor, there's so much power in the thinking ahead of time. So often what will happen is somebody will say, well, I hadn't thought about that. Or, gosh, that's a really good question. Like, what do I want? Like, what do I really want the outcome of this to look like? And what am I looking for from people? So when we start to think about it in that way, I use the phrase often, like, starting with the end in mind. So let's imagine that it's already over and you're telling me that it was really successful. So what would have happened to make that successful? So these are just some questions that you might use to explore in that sponsor interview. So the sponsor can be somebody who's asking for the meeting. Think about, on an Agile team, a retrospective, the sponsor for retros are the team. So some of the planning and design ahead of time with the team is, hey, rather than me as the scrum master or the facilitator saying, here's what we're going to do at your retro, I want to know from the team, this is their meeting. What do they want to do? What would be impactful for them? What's the outcome that they'd like to walk away from that meeting with? So that's the team making the move rather than me making the move. And when a team is invested in and has a say in the outcome of it and what they get out of it, it just changes the whole nature of it. It's no longer the facilitator calling the meeting and creating the outcomes. The outcomes are coming from the sponsor or the team. So out of that sponsor interview, I want to take away a really clear purpose statement, like why are we coming together? I want to have very clear outcomes. So we're either producing a document, a recommendation, an idea, a proposal. If we're in a retro, we're going to come away with, one or two, no more like actions that we as a team are committed to. But I want to know that in that planning phase, because then once I've got purpose and outcomes identified and I'm really clear on who's coming and then what's the scope of authority, that makes way for me to move into the space of design. And I'm focusing a little bit today on remote design because I'm making an assumption that for the most part, we're all kind of collectively still in this remote world and designing for online collaboration. But once I have the framework of my guiding purpose and outcomes, then it's easier to start to fill in. So how am I going to design a session that will get the team to the outcomes that they need to get to? So a couple of principles for this. There are, it's so easy, I think, online. I think one of the pitfalls of leading online is designing for your tool and not your outcome. There's so many fancy, smancy, exciting tools. I can't even keep up with them all anymore. This past 12 months, I think, has really brought to life so many different opportunities for everybody. But as you sit down to design, the tools are really helpful. But keep in mind your outcome first, and then find the tool that will support that. So as you sit down to design, just make sure that you sort of place that tool kind of secondary to what you're thinking about. The next aspect is designing for full participation. And this comes really closely to the third one down, which is level the playing field. So in designing for full participation, you don't create designs for just a portion of the group. And so really think about who's coming, who are the roles that they're playing, and create an activity that gets everybody involved. So if you have different stakeholders, then you might look to create small groups and have stakeholders spread out across groups. Tools like Zoom, I think Teams and Google Meet all are supporting breakouts these days, which is a fantastic way to design for full participation. And I think where you can lean on, dividing people up and then bringing people back together, and give something to people that helps them focus and unite their attention. So things like mural boards or Miro boards give people places to point to, and then they can collaborate, and that it tends to give them a shared language as well around how they are, the conversation that's coming out. So they're able to capture some of that conversation. If you think about, I asked you to go off into small groups and talk, and some of that conversation in this world kind of gets lost. So if that had a place to go, if we were as a team and we were working together, we'd want to create a way for some of that knowledge to stay and be visible to other members of the team, even though they might not have been in that small group conversation. So it falls into that space of designing for shared participation, for full participation, and giving people something to focus on that gives them a shared language. Another principle here is chunking it up. So we can't focus for long periods of time, and just finding ways to break it up so that there's maybe a 5-minute stretch break every hour and at least a 15-minute break every 2 hours, and really not working for much more than 2 hours at a time without a longer break. So find ways to chunk up the work that you're doing. 2020 was a huge social experiment in leveling the playing field. So prior to 2020, the big conversation was, what do we do if some of us are remote and others are in the room together? And when we're in the room together, it shifts the power in the group. So those in the room just naturally have more power than those online. And it's much harder to bring people in. 2020 pretty much solved that social interaction problem for us, when it's pretty the norm to have what we have today: one camera, one mic, and one sort of screen for everybody. And so as a facilitator, it's much easier to design. I think we are on the I have literally just left facilitating an executive offsite this morning, and that's the theme for their conversation right now, because I think that's the next hurdle, is as people go back to some form of being in the room together, there are some gifts that have been created by having a level playing field, and it creates more opportunities for equal participation. So to be really mindful, because I think that conversation is getting ready to come back about what does it look like when the playing field is not level, and to be really mindful of there's some good things that happen and the power dynamic shifts. So just be really mindful of what's the power dynamic and who might have more power than others in that conversation. And then my favorite question of all is to constantly be asking, what is the highest and best use of our time together? I will give you an example from this morning. Wordsmithing a document on how a goal is read is not the highest and best use of anybody's time in a collaborative session. But our highest and best use can be having the conversation about sort of what are the keywords. So in your design, just be thinking about always, and is that the highest and best use of our time together? Like really, really protecting that time that you pull people together and thinking about what is the best use and how can we do it in a more efficient and effective way. I think it's important to realize that it might take more than one session in the virtual world to spread things out and sort of peanut butter them out across multiple days, where you're just meeting for small sections of a day, allows that overnight soaking time. There is great benefit to talking about something and then going to sleep and then coming back to it the next day that really can shift the thinking in a group. And I had a bias for quite some time that virtual was not as good as face-to-face. And it was I guess it was 2015 that I really went to work on my own bias around that. And that has definitely helped me over the past year. But I think there's a lot of good that can happen online. I think the online environment actually is a little bit better suited for some things facilitative wise than others. So those are just some things to think about as you design for your remote space. There's a link here. You can download a Canvas planning toolkit for free if you want it, which provides some ways to think about questions for the sponsor interview and planning and design. And if you check out Lucid Spark, actually today, those templates launch live in their tool. So you can go peruse them and check out getting access to some of those. So the last part of this that I want to highlight, so there's planning and then there's design, and then there is when we get into the room, the very first thing that happens under this umbrella assumption of just jump in and get the work done is that we sometimes believe that we can just skip this whole part of connecting humans and just get on with the real work. I don't have time for the rest of that. And I would assert that you don't have time to not do it. So every time I think, because this is true for me as well, I get excited about something or I realize we're really tight on time and I just want to hop in and get the work done. And every time I do that, I recognize the impact that I'm having on the group and the impact that has on the quality of the conversation that emerges. People need a warm-up time. And so there's lots of different ways to do it. But I would just encourage you to look for, create a visual map of the virtual space, ask people to check in so that you hear everybody's voice. Everybody gets their voice into the space as a way to kind of warm up and prime the pump, and then we dive into the work. And it makes such a difference. Normalize collisions. People are going to speak at the same time. And we, at TeamCatapult, we have kind of a general operating rule, and I do it with teams that I'm working with as well. I ask people always to be off mute and on video. And that is probably counter to everything that you might be experiencing. But here's what we're missing in the remote world. We don't hear the laughs, the giggles, the sighs, the questions, I wanted to say something, like we're missing that. And by asking people to design their workspace so that they can be off mute for the most part, it changes the entire energy and dynamic in the room. So it's one of the ways that I think you can have one of the biggest impacts on creating connection in a remote space. And so just think about ways to design that for your teams when you're meeting online. So a little bit of check-in on the roadmap. We've talked about some common assumptions, the mindset around this, and then some just really practical ways, particularly in planning and design. If I had to point you to any place in the 90 minutes we're spending together today, it would be to start with, like, what's one thing that you're thinking that you might want to shift or change in your mindset? And then how do you create some space for planning and design? Like, how do you have that sponsor conversation? How do you really intentionally think about your arc? I think those two things can have the highest impact on the outcome of your meetings. And you might just type in the chat about, maybe what's one thing that you're going to do to bring more connection engagement, something that you've maybe been, it's maybe triggered a thought or inspiration for you today. And it would be great to just have you share them, because you'll likely inspire others here on the call to do something that you're thinking about. And then Mark shared this earlier, but if you want to learn more, there's a couple of places that I point you. First is to find somebody to co-facilitate with. I think there is no better way to learn facilitation than to find a co-facilitator for all kinds of reasons. You see different things, you'll learn from one another, you can give one another feedback around your facilitation. It helps in places where you feel like you might have a bit of content to add. You can also check out the book. So the Art and Science of Facilitate, or artandscienceoffacilitation.com will take you to book resources. There's a number of videos up there. And if you are someone who is feeling like you've got sort of the basics around facilitation and you're ready to take it up to the next level, I teach an advanced facilitation class, and it is all about working with conflict and being able to read the room and change the nature of the outcome. And so that class actually starts April 28th. And so we'd love to see you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I know there were a couple of questions, Mark, and there might be some more that have emerged.
Yeah, so I'll tell you what, we'll just work from the bottom up, because I think they kind of flow a little bit better that way. We had a question about, can you elaborate on who you feel like the sponsors are of the other Scrum events other than the retrospective?
I think it varies a bit about in terms of how teams are set up and how the organization is set up. Certainly in some of the bigger planning events, I think your product owner is likely to be the sponsor of some of those. You might have other managers who are kind of the primary sponsor of it. I think the team is often the sponsor of some of the more team-focused events around team chartering and retrospectives. Those are the individuals that stand to gain the most out of those. So I think it depends a little bit, but it's not always one individual.
Gotcha. Thanks, Marsha. So just as a challenge to me, I'll just say that's a breath of fresh air, because many times the teams can come to the Scrum Master and just plop down and say, okay, it's retrospective time. What are you going to teach us? But the role really should be reversed. It should be, what do you want to get out of this session, right?
Yeah. Mark, I think that is, I hear that comment so frequently about meetings in general. They're just feeling like teams don't want to come, or that they're dragging people through a process to get them. And I would just encourage you to think about how you reframe it and flip it around to letting the purpose of the meeting come from others. And when it comes from others, it's their agenda, not yours. You become a facilitator of it and a holder of that outcome. But I think it changes the energy around it as well.
Marsha, we're losing a few people here. Some people even have to take dogs out there, I think, crossing their legs to go outside. Another question we had, Marsha, was if you can just maybe recap which were the 4 assumptions that we make. Is there wisdom in why about that is?
Yeah, so there were the assumption around assuming that facilitation is a skill that everybody has. I think for that, what was the last part of that, Mark? You said, what is the thinking behind it?
Yeah, is there wisdom behind that?
Wisdom, yeah. I think that it's a really great question. Is there wisdom behind it? The assumption around facilitation and kind of who does it and what is its role. I think I'm really hung by the word wisdom. There's probably wisdom in that's a information from the system that's telling us something about the overall system, but I think it can come from a place of just needing to get work done or feeling overwhelmed by the amount of things that are on your plate, or potentially just not even, I think a lot of people aren't even aware that there's a whole body of knowledge around the practice of facilitation and that it's a competency to be developed. So I think that there's aspects of that that sit behind that. And then, the other two things that we looked at today, we're sort of jumping right into the work and, hosting a meeting like it's a phone call. I think it sits in that same place. I think it can come from a really good intention of we just got to get stuff done. And I know how to pull people together, and I know how to keep a conversation flowing, and just not necessarily aware that there's actually some science and techniques around listening for what people are saying and how they're talking. It's like a different lens, I think, to look through.
I'll have to ask you, Marsha, is it almost a thankless task that when facilitation is done well, you really aren't aware of a facilitator leading?
I think so. I have been talking about facilitation for many years now, and I find that if you're a trained facilitator, you'll see it, whether it's there or not in the room. I think if you don't have that lens that you're looking through, and I find often executives are in particular can be very dismissive of it as a competency or value. And I hold that it's probably one of the most underutilized leadership skills that we have. And I think anybody in an organization, regardless of the role that you play, from the CEO on down, can really benefit from, thinking about facilitation. I believe facilitation is, I believe having a conversation is about leadership. And it is think about your work that you do and how many conversations you have with people day in and day out. Where do our norms come from? Where does what we value come from? How do we get work done? It is all through the nature of the relationships and the conversations that we have with people. And so being able to do that in a way that's inclusive, and we're really mindful about how the balance of speaking happens, and who speaks and then who speaks after that other person, and where does that get out of whack or become imbalanced, and where do we start to lose hearing all voices. I think all of that's so fundamental and critical, and yet I don't know, there's something about it that's very easy to overlook, or just say we're getting by just fine.
Really interesting question, Marsha. Will a facilitator sometimes have to coach, and is that a bad thing?
Yeah, I think as Agile, I think as Agile coaches, we absolutely will facilitate. I think we'll coach. I think we'll teach. I think we'll mentor. I've done a lot of work with the ICAgile learning objectives around Agile coaching. And if you're interested, I'd really point you in that direction to take a look at that whole Agile coaching track. But I think as Agile Scrum Masters or coaches, I do think that there are places where, so I can give you I'll try to give you a concrete example. I think there are moments in working with a team where I might be facilitating them, meaning we might be in a retro, for say, and we're working towards a desired outcome, and we're talking and reflecting on, how we've been working together. But I have my facilitator hat on because I'm just paying attention to the conversation and where we're going. And then if I start to notice maybe people, fade out of the conversation, or all of a sudden the energy sort of drops off, I might begin to put my team coaching hat on rather than my facilitator hat on, and just get really curious about the dynamic that just happened in the room. I might say, so I noticed it just got really quiet in here. So what's happening for you? And from that, it might be that some email came in and everybody's looking at their email, right? So, that could be one thing. Or it could be that the team has just stumbled on a really important thing that nobody wants to talk about. And at that point, I would tend, in my facilitation stance, I would tend to step out of my facilitation stance and a bit more into my team coaching stance, where I begin to ask the team to look at, so what's happening? What is it like to have retros on this team? What is it like to talk about those kinds of things in this type of conversation? So, yeah, I do. I think you do.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I think that's all the questions that have been posted via chat. Do you want to have open mic for the next 5 minutes, Marsha?
Yeah, we totally can.
Well, if you have a question for Marsha, if you want to just unmute yourself, step up to the mic, you're more than welcome.
Hey, Marsha, question for you, which is,
yeah,
could you talk a little bit more about the difference between a coach's role and a facilitator's role?
This is actually it has been a topic that I care quite a bit about. And so in the book, I spent some time delineating actually how I look at what I would call facilitation, somewhat of advanced facilitation, and then team coaching. And so I do distinguish quite a bit the difference between facilitating a team, which would, for me, would be all the things that we just talked about. Like, we're coming together for a purpose. I'm really focused on helping the team talk about the objective and the outcomes of the meeting. And I think there any moment in time where the team, if I start to notice group dynamics or interpersonal dynamics, for me, that becomes a bit more of a team coaching hat. And then there's a bit of a intentionality for me about, is it appropriate to do that now? Or do I do that at some other point? When do I really start to help a team look at how they work interpersonally so that they're able to have difficult conversations and they're able to stick with topics that require trust and empathy and different aspects of working together and collaborating. And so for me, I do distinguish a little bit between facilitating towards an outcome in a meeting versus facilitating a team to grow and improve, to grow their team development and team performance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions?
Maybe time for one more.
Yeah.
Last chance.
Well, I can just throw something out there that it's a little bit off track, but you did talk about how when we have remote meetings, how everyone, it's a more level playing field, and that it's also important as a facilitator to make sure that everyone gets more or less equal talking time, or at least proportional talking time. And I keep wondering, when is Zoom going to do something where there's a visual up on the screen, like a dot or something that gets put up every time we talk, and then it's like a relative length of time? Because I seriously think that could be revolutionary in how we do things.
I think you should submit that as a feature request. It's with a team coaching hat on, actually. I think it's data to a team that I think even me in a team, I would sometimes tend to not be aware of those things. And so when you have information radiators like that could help you see the team dynamics a little bit differently, I do think that that's one of the roles of a team coach. And so, yeah, I love it. You should definitely. I'm sure
that Marsha Acker supports this.
Yeah, I think it would be great. Nice. All right.
Marsha, I just wanted to say thank you so much. This has been helpful. And it's true that sometimes we just think that facilitation is just something but then, like you said, it's a skill that has to be learned. So thank you so much. And I look forward to maybe attending the advanced class.
Yeah, it'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was lovely to be here today. You all have an amazing community. And Jamie and Mark, I appreciate the invitation. It's been great.
Yeah, so we just appreciate you so much, Marsha. Absolutely fantastic job. We give you a standing ovation. Yeah.
Nice.
Appreciate everyone. So
yeah, be
anything
well
else
and
to
enjoy
close,
your
Marsha?
facilitation journey. What's that?
I just ask anything else to close?
I just say enjoy your facilitation journey, and as you grow your own facilitation, I just encourage you to co-facilitate and grow others.
Right, great.
All right, take care, everybody. Have
Great
a great
seeing
day.
everybody. We'll
Bye-bye.
see you next month. Thank you again, Marsha.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks, Mark. Bye.